Alright, let's talk Way of Kings. So, if you don't know, The Way of Kings is the first installation in Brandon Sanderson's capstone ongoing epic fantasy series called Stormlight Archive. This is his metaphorical big guy of work, if you know what I'm saying. Like, in terms of series and fantasy undertakings, this is his biggest body of work and the one he's definitely invested the most time and thought into. It also so happens to be the series that I'm currently reading. I finished Way of Kings a couple weeks ago at the time of recording this, maybe a month or so, and I'm around halfway through the second novel, which is Words of Radiance. So, in terms of the book itself, I feel like I finally have some context. I've wanted to talk about this book for a long time, but now that I've finished it and I've kind of gotten a sizable amount of extra material by reading the second book, I feel like I can finally speak about the book in its entirety, and I can fully speak on the completed character arcs of the characters in the first book, and I feel like that's just where I want to start. So, to be clear, I'm not going to just make one episode on this book because I like it too much and it would be too long, and I also have way too much to say about it, but I was thinking I'm going to start with discussing two of the 3 or 4 or so main perspectives and points of view and characters that we see in this novel. So, anyways, as I interpreted it, this book really has 3 main points of view and 3 main characters that are constantly receiving chapters upon chapters of, I'll call it screen time, but it's basically just the amount of pages and amount of time that their perspective is being shown, and they're also being discussed by other characters as well. So these 3 are Kaladin, Shallan, and Dalinar. These are the 3 that I really felt not only just had the most chapters, but also had the most complete storylines that will be continually followed up upon, especially during the second book as well. Like, when I'm discussing these, I'm going to talk about how the scope of what happened during the first novel kind of extended into the second novel a little bit, but this is essentially just discussing what happened during the first novel. Anyway, so when you're reading this, you really get the understanding that Kaladin is the main character in this book, and the majority of the focus really goes to him. You're meant to understand him and his motivations and really spend a lot of time with his character because he's kind of he is Brandon Sanderson's main segue into talking about surge bindings, and he is like the guy that things are happening to. So, that being said, this book has just so many perspectives and points of view. I mean, it has 88 full-length chapters, including the interludes and the epilogue and the prologue. So, it's a lot. But, yeah, that being said, with all those points of view to keep track of and so much world building, it's really reductive to say that there is just a main character, but he's just the one that is the most focused on and the most prominent. At the same time, as I mentioned, there's Shallan. Like, she has a completely separate, isolated plotline from Kaladin. She never crosses paths with him once during the first book. And in this novel, she doesn't have any connection with the Shattered Plains, so it seems, except for you're shown that through Jasna, who is Dalinar's niece, their stories are intertwined, and you kind of infer that at some point they'll converge in some way, shape, or form, which makes sense, and it's really a nice setup for the convergence of their storylines. But at the point of this novel, they're parallel. They don't cross at all. So anyway, that's just one example of how there are just so many storylines in this novel and so many points of view that it's difficult to just pinpoint who the most important characters are. And that being said, there are more characters in there, such as Adolin, who is Dalinar's son, who also have a significant amount of chapters, but I wouldn't really consider a main character. He's just an important supplemental character that is critical to multiple of those like main trio's storylines. But he's still worth discussing, I believe, because he does have kind of, it's not necessarily a super unique role, but it is an interesting position that plays into and affects a lot of the happenings of the novel, so I think he's important to touch on as well. But there's also a lot of other characters who just have one-off chapters or chapters in interludes where you get a glimpse into a sliver of a completely separate story of someone's completely separate life that you have, honestly, many times during this novel, I had no idea how these interludes And I still don't, honestly. Even halfway through the second book, some of those interludes have not come back at all. And it's a little bit confusing, but it just shows how many open threads that Brandon Sanderson leaves to hopefully like tie back into this braid of novels, because he just, let's be honest, he has so much real estate to work with. He has like more books than a normal series that are all like triple the length of like a normal novel. So he has a lot of pages to work with, so I'm confident that he'll bring those back. But it's just interesting to kind of like tease us with little glimpses of really interesting offshoots, but just never bring them back, at least in like recent memory. Like I find myself sometimes when like old character from one of those interludes comes up, I'll have to strain to remember, because honestly they haven't been brought up in like hundreds of pages or even like 1,000 pages. So it's just a little bit much, if you know what I'm saying. Anyway, I mean, I think this also carries over in terms of world building. You're kind of hit in the face with it. And even if that is to be expected, since like first of all, it's a Brandon Sanderson novel, but also with a novel and series of that size, I'd certainly hope it was thorough and complex and wonderful and really interesting. But you also do have to come to terms with it really quickly, because you're very much so thrown in, especially with like in the beginning of the novel, you're kind of, the prelude is essentially a snapshot of their religion, of Voranism, right? But looking back, this prelude is very much a hard launch, a definite hard launch of this religion, of this whole world. And even now, like reading it again, still, we don't have answers. We don't have answers. Almost 2,000 pages later, we don't have answers. So I think that's pretty funny. But it's just so interesting. And we're introduced right away to the heralds. We're introduced to people, characters who live thousands of years before the current cast of characters, and their conflicts. They literally betrayed one of their friends, and they broke the oath pact. And this is like setting up their entire religion, the entire basis of Voranism that the Ardents and stuff reference. This is essentially taking place during the Last Desolation, which is an event that has only been referenced a handful of times, and we're not quite sure its impact on the current events of the story at all. We just know that it's this part of the past that kind of set up the Knights Radiant or whatever. I don't even fully understand how the Heralds are related to the Radiants, but I think that's more of a me comprehension thing. But the Oath Pact has not been referenced since that chapter. We don't know anything about it. We don't know anything about how the Heralds left Talano behind. We know nothing. We just know that some of these Heralds' names have been referenced on and off, like just a little bit by some of the characters, but it generally is just kind of left alone. It's a very throw you in kind of situation, even if it does dial back as we get into the actual chapters. Now, before I talk about those three characters themselves, I want to give you an idea of the scope of this book, in case you haven't read it, which I'm assuming many of you haven't, but just keep in mind, I'll try to keep spoilers light, but I will be discussing the complete character arcs and the more or less complete plot of this book, so I will have to mention spoilers, but I'll let you know when I do, for the most part. So this book is 5 parts, and it consists of a total of 88 chapters, including the interludes. So it's no small task to sit down and read this book. But I do think that Brandon Sanderson does a lovely job of keeping the reader engaged and wanting to find out what happens next, because even in the more duller or like calmer parts of the book, there's still a sense of suspense that leads you to keep driving forward and wanting to complete the book, and to, even after the first book, have the anticipation for the second book that makes you want to pick it up. I found this happen a lot during his other series, Mistborn, where I sped through the first book, but I think at some point during the second book there was kind of a lull in which it was very politically heavy and very like political jargon, political like interaction heavy. That wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. It didn't really focus heavily on world building or characters or just like action, but it was still bearable enough to, once you got through it, you still wanted to find out what happened. You still wanted to keep reading, and I didn't think at any point during Mistborn that I would want to put the book down. So I really feel like that is something that he does really well, regardless of the size of his novel. Anyway, so today I'll be talking specifically about Kaladin and Dalinar for a couple of reasons. I mean, like I said, Kaladin's like the big boy in this novel. He's the general focus, but I also feel like his storyline in his novel is pretty easy to boil down. It makes sense that it makes sense, and it's the original trial and the backstory that led up to the big challenge that serves as both an introduction and a whole plotline for his character. So it's all encompassing in a way, even though it has its own origin story. So like Kaladin's arc in this book has its own origin story, but it is kind of an all-encompassing type plot. Like, in other words, if I were to explain Kaladin's arc in this novel, it would be the origin story and the setup of getting past some of the mental blocks that he has in his mind from his past, and this is the setup for the rest of the novels. Like, this initial challenge serves as an introduction to the tenacity of his character, an introduction to what he really stands for and what drives him and what will drive him, like what used to drive him and how he has changed. And it's basically a jumping off point for the rest of the novel. His character will continue to develop, and it will develop in a way that is established in this first book. Anyway, so yeah, what I'm talking about is his stint as a bridgeman and how it is this big challenge that he has to overcome, and it seems impossible to overcome. This bridgeman arc is essentially, I mean, Brandon Sanderson does a very good job of making sure that you feel hopeless during this arc. Like, Kaladin himself, the way he is written, feels hopeless. It feels desolate. He is down in the dumps for so long during this novel. Like, honestly, at times I have felt that Kaladin has been, during this book, a very distinctly unlikable character. Like, you want to root for him, and I did. I found myself really rooting for him throughout this novel. But he really, due to his trauma, was a very depressed character for a lot of this novel. And he also was just very, like, combative. He wouldn't be spurred to action. So I think that myself and possibly other readers might have had that same qualm with him, because he really did just make it hard to find positivity in his situation because it was such a bad situation. But I think that's also really interesting, because as much as I could complain about Kaladin being that way and just being very whiny and just absolutely like hopeless and having almost no motivation besides keeping the bridgemen safe, he was an example of a character who was depressed. His trauma and his circumstances led him to feel that he had no way out. At one point, he was going to a chasm, right? And he wanted to, well, trigger warning, but he wanted to kill himself. But he couldn't even muster the energy to do that. So it's a very solid depiction of someone who is really struggling mentally as a result of their trauma. And I think that while that could be kind of a downer to read, it was a very important low point for Kaladin, and Brandon Sanderson did a good job illustrating that, because, I mean, it was frustrating to read, but, you know, eventually, once he got out of that, the juxtaposition between Kaladin's lowest of the low and the small victories that eventually led up to, like, a bigger victory were more impactful because of that. I also chose to discuss Dalinar in this same episode because his story, in my opinion, is a little more nuanced conceptually. Not necessarily because he's been through more. I actually think that it's the opposite. I think Kaladin has more trauma and more plot, but Dalinar has more nuance to his situation, and so we're kind of thrown into a complete parallel to Kaladin, and that's also another reason I chose it, but I chose him to talk about in the same episode as Kaladin, because their stories are kind of intertwined. They're both at the same war camp, but one of them is at the lowest of the low, and one of them is basically at the highest position that you could be at, next to the king, and still seems to have more influence even than the king. And yet, they're both interesting, and they both have their own struggles that are equally as impactful to the story as a whole. So that's why I think that they both serve as the perfect dichotomy to each other, and their stories really complement each other, and the build-up that leads to their eventual crossing of paths is very, very solid, I think. And it makes sense for them to be discussed in the same breath and to also have their stories compared. But the reason I say that I think his story is a little more nuanced than Kaladin is because Kaladin's, like I said, is pretty easy to boil down, even if there is so many different factors that go into it. He is a bridgeman. He is thrown in to the worst possible scenario and is forced to survive that and overcome that. And because of his intrinsic sense of honor and loyalty, he overcomes his mental roadblock to helping others, to give in to his innate desire to help others be free. And you see that come through in his character, as he won't be willing to let anyone die, and how when people do die, that weighs on his mind. So it's a very solid framework for an introduction into Kaladin and to his crew, and to give him a supporting set of characters. But it is also just straightforward. There isn't much like political nuance to his situation currently, at least. So when he's there, you know what his challenge is, you know what his end goal is, and when at the end there is some sort, or when in like kind of the third of the novel, there is more like nuance to his situation thrown in, you still understand that this is where his end goal kind of either was reached or went askew, and you understand how he got there. But Dalinar in this novel doesn't really have a full arc. He does, but there's no like beginning, middle, reach the goal. He has more of a unique situation, like I said, due to his like higher standing in the camp, but also his obstacle that he has to overcome is not a physical thing. It's something that comes from within his own mind. He has fits during high storms that he can't escape, but he has to kind of learn what they mean, and he has all of this on his head while trying to balance his image and reputation. Kaladin as a bridgeman doesn't have to balance his reputation, so I think that's an important juxtaposition, because Dalinar's position is inherently more delicate, even if it's not as physically, if it's not endangering him physically at the moment. Okay, to my point as well, that at times I think Dalinar is a more nuanced choice to make like a main focus and main character in this novel. Is it makes sense as a reader, Kaladin's importance in the overall like setup of powers in this novel. Like in this novel, it's called Surge Bindings, and it just makes sense. You expect Kaladin to be a part of this. You don't necessarily expect Dalinar to be a part of this, even though he has the position that he has. And let me explain why. In Kaladin, you have, from the beginning, he has this moniker of Stormblessed, while he's in Emerem's army. And this has nothing to do with him being powerful. This has something to do with his tactical thinking and his ability to protect his squadron, I guess, with his proficiency with a spear. And while this moniker isn't initially meant in that way, it's a nice bit of foreshadowing by Brandon Sanderson to include it like that, because you see it come back full circle when Dalinar uses it, even if he also is ignorant to Kaladin's actual situation as actually being Stormblessed, actually being a Surge Binder. So I think that was a really nice little bit of foreshadowing, a nice little thread that Sanderson included, but it also makes it obvious that obviously Kaladin has a part in this. But it is still really triumphant the moment Kaladin realizes he has powers. The moment he is strung up in the high storm, it's just brutal, because you know it's a real situation, and he doesn't come out from it unscathed. He just comes out from it barely alive. You know, he doesn't even, at that point, he's at his lowest point multiple times in this novel, but that was a true, like, moment of holding your breath as a reader, because you know he'll survive it, but he was really in a bad shape after that high storm. And it was just so dramatic, because high storms are like the pinnacle of this novel. They're the focus, because that's what their world revolves around. So to be strung up and to go out in a storm that literally forces everyone to be inside and is the basis of their mythology, of the Stormfather, of their spheres, of infusing their spheres with stormlight. To be strung up in that is so powerful visually that it was just a very impactful moment, that it just is the culmination of when he's recovering from that, to find that he has powers when he's at his literal lowest physical point is just very impactful as a reader. And I really enjoyed that. So I will say, I think I'm driving a little bit too far into the point that I think Dalinar's situation has more nuance than Kaladin, because it was really well done, but it's just expected that he has powers. That's what I'm trying to say. Like I was saying earlier, I think it is a little bit easy to chalk Kaladin up as a little bit annoying, because I feel like I definitely got that vibe from him during this novel, just due to the amount of time he spent complaining and being sad. But it is a very realistic depiction. He went through so much more than the reader can even like fathom at times, you know? So it makes sense that he acts like this, and it also is set up by Sanderson that even when he was just a normal kid in his hometown at home, even before his brother was taken to the army, he was a little bit depressed. You know, it was mentioned that during the time of the weeping, like, he got this kind of seasonal depression, and only his brother was able to pull him out of that. So it makes sense that that kind of mood was carried over by his character to a greater extent during this time period, during his period as a bridge runner. So it makes sense, but I understand where the annoying allegations come in, because I did feel it too. I also am coming into this a little bit in hindsight, because during Words of Radiance, I think this attitude is even more poignant. Like, I really, in his interactions with other people, sometimes it is witty banter, and I appreciate it, but sometimes it's just hard to read. Like, sometimes Kaladin is just so utterly standoffish and bad at interacting with other people that it just makes my skin crawl. Like, it's just hard because he's unlikable in the second novel. But I still stick with him because I know that he is a good character. It's difficult to kind of see his interactions and be like, man, Kaladin, like, what are you doing? Like, you're not in that bad situation anymore. And I know it's hard to pull yourself out of that mindset, but, you know, hoping for his growth. But also, I think the one most singular thing that I have a qualm with about Kaladin's character that I haven't seen improve at all throughout these two books is the way he treats Syl, this friend that chose him. I think she's such an interesting character. I think she's such an interesting addition, and I really like her. She just seems so eager to learn, and she is a literal Spren who is not supposed to have sentience, gaining sentience, and being able to explore the world for the first time, and having this person that she chose the absolute, while he may be honorable, while he may have the attributes that would attract her to him, and he is a good person, I believe, but she chose the person that is down in the dumps all the time and never treats her right. All of his interactions with Syl, he responds to her with like one word, doesn't give her the answers she wants, questions her all the time, and it's just so frustrating because I love her. And yeah, anyway, it does bug me a little bit, but she's just so logic defying for the universe they're in. She's not supposed to exist, even though we see Shallan have pattern, but it really does not make sense to me how he treats her that way consistently. Even as his nature improves, even as his situation improves, he doesn't ever have engaging conversations with her, which confuses me because she's not an annoying Windspren anymore. He should be more fascinated with her. Like Rock is, even though Rock comes from a place of reverence, but at least, you know, he engages. Even, in the second novel, even, what's his name? Sigzil shows more interest in Syl, which I guess, you know, when you have something around you for a long period of time, you kind of get accustomed to their presence. But Syl has helped him stay alive so many times. During that high storm I mentioned, she helped him stay alive. There's just so many other examples of that, such as when he was a slave, the Leaves, that, come on, like, put some respect on Syl's name. Anyway. But that being said, I still am really interested in Kaladin. I think Sanderson does a really great job at breaking down his characters to their lowest and most innate people and innate like situations, and then empowering them in the same period of time to create this really dramatic juxtaposition that is what keeps the novel moving forward. Like that moment of desperation and then subsequent moment of triumph is the most important device, I feel like, because he makes his characters helpless in preparation for their empowerment. He brings them to their lowest point to make both them and the reader savor their resurgence even more. He brings the stakes up and then proposes real risks and decisions that the characters have to make, such as the choice between freedom or honor when faced with the battle at the tower when Sadius betrays Dalinar. This is a turning point because the Bridgemen reached their goal. They are so close to potential freedom, to attempting to make it, even if their situation would have been still terrible because they would also be branded as slaves. They still have that opportunity that they were planning for, that they were training for, to make a break for it, to run. And no one would have followed them at that same moment. But they chose honor. They chose Dalinar. They chose to help him, even if it was a futile attempt. And at that spearhead of that decision was Kaladin. And I think that point when their paths crossed was just a big moment for both of the stories. Dalinar was fighting for his life, but he was getting worn down, and he needs Kaladin to make that decision, to be honorable, to prove to Syl, even, who's the honor spren, that he is worthy of her. And he does. He goes and shows that. But it was just such a big turning point to me that shows that helplessness versus empowerment. They're plowing into a helpless situation where they'll probably die. They're bridgemen, like how against armies of Parshendi that are like overwhelming Dalinar's well-trained army, and they're going and they're saving the day. This moment of hopelessness that they're charging into is spurred by their decision to be honorable, is pushed by Kaladin to cross paths with Dalinar and to ultimately become empowered and to break free of their current situation. That's the climax of this Bridgeman arc. That is really well executed, in my opinion. So, there's that. Also, following through with Kaladin, there are things that Sanderson likes to do that is kind of like a really obvious and well-utilized literary tactic where you introduce this backstory to the character by mention only. And it shapes their current motivations and actions that prolong having to reveal it for as long as possible. But it doesn't get too tedious, I will say, although you kind of start to form an idea of what actually happened at some point, and then when it ends up being revealed, it's not as dramatic, and it's not as, revelation as you might have expected. But I will say, he does this a little too often. He did it with Kaladin in the first novel, he's doing it with Shallan in the second novel, and it is, a recurring thing that I picked up on, so I thought it was worth mentioning, because it's not necessarily an unnecessary amount of build-up, but it is a lot longer than I would have expected for a normal, arc. In the end, when you realize... Sorry, another spoiler. This is full of spoilers, I'm really sorry, but I kind of have to in order to discuss this. When you realize that the reason that he was as a slave in the first place was because Amaran betrayed him, and his brother was in the army, and then he volunteered in, a Katniss Everdeen type... his brother was selected by this vengeful, high Bright Lord, and then he had to follow and keep his brother safe, and he failed. You inferred that. But when it is revealed, it's kind of finally, Brandon won't be alluding to this anymore. But yeah, he does do it often. He's doing it in this Words of Radiance book with Shallan, with her, and he does start this from the very beginning. He starts this from all the way in Way of Kings, when he hints that, she has, a darker backstory. And little pieces are slowly getting more revealed as we spend a lot more time with Shallan, in Words of Radiance. And I actually do like Shallan as a character. I don't know what other people's opinions of her are, but I think it's interesting. Not necessarily that she does the right thing all the time. She is naive. She's kind of annoying sometimes. But all the characters are, and I think her arc is interesting enough to just warrant me speaking on it a lot. Anyway, this is about Kaladin and Dalinar. So, But yeah, I do think, like, with Kaladin's reveal of his origin story, there are some qualms that come to mind, more so in how Kaladin acts, because I feel like when I read novels, I don't know about you guys, but I do get this kind of like strange superiority complex that, like, obviously you feel like when you're reading it from the outside, oh, you could do better, you would make better decisions, but like maybe I'm biased because I want to eventually be a surgeon, but he had the good life. He had the medical training, but no, he wanted to be a soldier. He needed to fight in the battlefield. Like, maybe it's a product of their society, of Vorinism, that, oh, in order to reach heaven, the Almighty chooses his strongest warriors and brings them into the afterlife to fight for the Tranquiline Halls. But it seems to me like if you're a soldier in the real world and then you die on the battlefield, do you really want to be fighting an endless war in heaven? I don't know. But Kaladin really wants to be a soldier, and at the end of the day, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't fault him for it. That's what their society encourages, and that is, like, it's a noble thing. To be able to be a soldier, it's cool, it is just cool. But being a surgeon is cool too, and you could have made bank. Even though his father's selflessness did irk me, so I kind of understand where the annoyingness comes from, because he's just not charging for his services and no one likes him. It's frustrating. But I digress. Kaladin's origin makes sense. Okay, on to Dalinar for this part. I think his visions are so interesting. I during this novel, I really liked when we got to learn about his visions. I thought it was so interesting. And the fact that we were, like, in it with him and we got to speculate about, like, what was going on. But, like, eventually, when we stopped, like, being present in his visions because we kind of had enough context to just infer what was happening every time, we still don't get answers, which I think is really interesting by Sanderson, because none of the characters know, and we also don't know. There's no dramatic irony there in knowing what the visions are about. We just know, ultimately, that they're important, but we have no idea. So I honestly really enjoyed when Navani and Dalinar, oh, I think they're so cute, by the way. I think Navani and Dalinar are so cute. But they're also just, like, equally as, like, I don't know how to explain it. But there's just something about them that's, like, it's heartwarming, but it's also, like, they're so proper. Even if Navani tries to, like, not be. But they still are. But I think it's cute having the, like, scribe type girl cozying up to Dalinar while he's mentally incapacitated. I'm just kidding. But anyway, yeah, during the high storms, I think I really enjoyed when they started to finally make some leeway in understanding that what he was saying during his visions actually translated into important things, and when they were finally able to prove that his visions meant something, it was just such a win, because Adolin was such a skeptic too, and, like, it just felt good. So I think that even with the, like, less action-based position that Dalinar has sometimes, that was just a good, like, culmination moment that made me happy, even if we don't actually have answers yet. I also think it was a really interesting detail that I think is kind of easily forgotten about because it's not really revisited, but how his visions kind of lie to him. Like, we're given the sense that they're pre-recorded, but when he asks about Sadius and when he asks certain things to try in the early stages to try and verify that they're real, because he's desperate. His reputation is on the line. His reputation with his family is on the line, which is arguably more important because he needs those allies. Like, he's in a position where he needs all the allies that he can get. So it basically tells him, yes, you can trust Sadius, and then bam, there's, like, the biggest betrayal. And honestly, at that point, when he's betrayed, you're kind of starting to actually feel like Dalinar is in danger. Like, you wonder if that's it for Dalinar, even if his story is bigger than that, because Brandon Sanderson is not afraid to kill off some of his main characters, although it would seem too abrupt. So I don't think he was in real danger of dying, but it is a concern too, because it was a really high stakes, dangerous position for him to be in, and you also see Adolin kind of trying to step up and becoming more like his father in that sense, and having more responsibility placed on him. So you think maybe Dalinar's arc is coming to an end, but it's not. And I'm so glad it isn't, because he is an important figure, not only as to prove to Kaladin that there are honorable light eyes, that there are people who are willing to at least weigh all the options and not just make decisions based on the preconceived notions of society, such as light eyes and dark eyes. But you also see this character who, while he is an anomaly for light eyes, is also kind of bound to their customs. He can't just be like, he can make Kaladin a captain, but he can't just be like open about it. Like, he can't completely subvert expectations. But he is, despite him being the epitome of non-rebellious, you know what I mean? Like, as a character, he's very prim, he sticks to the codes, he always wears a uniform, he's an imposing tyrant of a war veteran, a war like monger kind of, when he was younger at least. He is this imposing character, and yet you see him rebelling in both big and small ways that kind of subvert your expectations about Dalinar and make him have that nuance I was talking about. Not only his relationship with Navani, who is his dead brother's ex-wife, and that is in and of itself is a little bit of like a social subversion, but also in his promotion of Kaladin, freeing of the Bridgemen, proving that he is willing to give up a shard blade for them. That's a big act. It's a statement. It's not necessarily what it is, it's what it entails, that he is willing to do that for them. It's like one-upping Sadeas, saying, I have the moral high ground here. You abandoned me. But the war camp doesn't turn on Sadeas in order to preserve that order that they have. Which is interesting because the High Princes are so keen on preserving that order when it benefits them for the Gem Hearts. But when Dalinar tries to come in and politically maneuver a way in order to actually win the war or to unite Alethkar, it's just, they hate it because of greed. And I think the High Princes and Dalinar's playing field that he's on is different than Kaladin's, because he has to contend with, while Kaladin has to contend with the greed of Light Eyes from a lower perspective, like he has to kind of have a personal affront to that, Dalinar has to have an eye-to-eye level contention with that greed and that pride. He has to fight it in ways that are not overt. He can't just be like Kaladin and just be upstart and obstinate, because from him it wouldn't be upstart and obstinate, it would just be offensive to the others of his station. And I think in a way Dalinar's situation is even more futile than Kaladin, because he knows he has to do something. He's being told the Everstorm comes, beware odium, all these things, and he's like, I have no idea what this means. Men in this universe aren't even allowed to read. They don't know this. They know all their information secondhand through scholars. It's honestly commendable that he was willing to sit through a reading of the Way of Kings. Like an audiobook of a huge book of codes. That's like having a law manuscript read to you. It would suck. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, like, he has to contend with all of this. He has to contend with the greed and the pride of other Light Eyes. He has to manage his delicate relationship with the king and Sadeas, and just mask his hatred for someone who betrayed him so openly. But according to Vorin custom, it's fine, because betrayal that everyone knows about is not nearly as bad as a personal offense to their face, right? Like, it is a messed up society. And even in the gender distinction, like with the safe hand, you see Brandon Sanderson makes it clear that this is not a universal thing. This is a very country specific thing. Dark eyes even have different ways of covering their safe hand. It's just like these rules of propriety were set up for this society long ago, and they're still sticking to it. You see it, I think, in Words of Radiance, there is a mention of there are women and men who are grooms, or how do I say this? Like, who tend to horses. And they cite that they are both able to because it wasn't mentioned in this book that dictates propriety and what are feminine and masculine arts and trades. And this book was written ages ago, and they're still sticking to it as a society. And the minute they find something that wasn't in there because horses didn't really exist at the time, they're like, oh, let's both do it. So it's just societal. It's a societal construct. And you see it in Shalyn when she is obviously like a Vorin woman, so she covers her hand, and she's from Jacaved. But you see the flexibility there. You see when she encounters people that don't cover it, she is surprised. But Sanderson, I guess, makes a point of showing that this Voran religion is not the only one in this diverse world that he's created. Like, there are people who are much less proper, who have different customs. So I think this serves to show that Alethi society is over the top. They exaggerate, they're dramatic about things, they take things too seriously, and this juxtaposition between literally themselves and the rest of the world is so strong that you just are so frustrated because they're so proper all the time, yet they're also conniving and evil and prideful that it's hard to take that propriety seriously. They're proper, they're modest, but they make all these rules up. They have distinctions for what men and women can eat, what men and women can do, and at the end of the day, they can both do it, so it means nothing. So I appreciate Sanderson making that clear, because it's kind of, throughout these novels, he's like poking fun at the Alethi. He's saying everyone else finds these customs absurd, but to them, it's their way of life, and they're basing their way of life off of books written long ago by someone who probably wasn't even qualified. It's not like the Almighty was telling them to do things certain ways, but they take those proper codes as gospel, and then they run with it while ignoring the greater moral failures of their society. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I almost forgot to talk about this, but Dalinar visited the Night Watcher, and another example of his quiet rebellion, of his rebellious nature that doesn't at all fall into line with his reputation as one of the greatest warriors and most, like, uptight people in this novel. He visited the Night Watcher and is familiar with the old magic. He sought the old magic after his wife died. He was willing to bear that curse that he knew would happen. And it's crazy. It's interesting that he is just so subversive of expectations. They're actively discouraged. Alethi are actively discouraged from having anything to do with that sort of thing. So for him to go and seek that strange magic out is indicative of his character, of the nuances that fall within that stoic front. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is going back to his visions for a brief moment. The Almighty was revealed to him, and Dalinar alone, to be dead. And his visions were told to be pre-recordings. So obviously when he asked about Sadeas, like, he didn't receive an actual answer. But it's still interesting to know that the basis of their entire religion and a god figure in their novel is able to be killed. And this is something that Sanderson is familiar with, like gods and their volatile nature, and he writes a lot about how they're not omnipresent, omnipotent, they're not unable to be killed. But even still, to have a god that is already known to be dead and yet still somehow has influence in the future of this novel is just so interesting, and it just is a testament to Dalinar's importance in this story. And his futile attempt to unite Alethkar before a certain thing happens, like, he doesn't even know how this important event will occur, but he's just blindly trying to fight it. Thank you so much for sitting down and discussing one of my favorite things of all time with me. It really means a lot for you guys to tune in every 2 weeks, and I know this episode was a lot longer, but it really just shows how much I have to say on this topic, and hopefully more episodes will be of varied lengths in the future. But I really do appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye!